My name is Daniel, and for the past 10 years, I thought I was living the dream. My wife, Lauren, and I built what seemed like a perfect life together. A cozy house in the suburbs, shared vacations to exotic places, and what I thought was unshakable trust. But trust is a fragile thing, and in the blink of an eye, it can shatter into pieces too small to put back together. It all started with what I can only describe as a gut feeling. Lauren had always been lively and talkative, but over the past few months, she'd grown distant. I told myself it was the stress from her new job. Lauren had been promoted to a high-profile marketing position at a big firm downtown, and with it came late nights, business dinners, and endless conference calls. I was proud of her, or at least I told myself I was, because deep down something felt wrong. She started coming home later and later, claiming that her boss, Chris, was demanding and had her working on time-sensitive projects. I didn't think much of it at first. Chris was a name that came up often in her stories about work. According to Lauren, he was a brilliant but intimidating leader. She spoke about him with such admiration that I started to feel a twinge of jealousy. But I brushed it off, convincing myself it was all in my head. The first real red flag came during a Sunday brunch with our friends. Lauren and I had always been a team at social gatherings, laughing and finishing each other's sentences. But this time, she was glued to her phone, barely acknowledging anyone. When I leaned over to ask if everything was okay, she snapped, "Can't you just let me handle my work? Not everything is about you, Daniel." The room fell silent, and I felt a pang of embarrassment. That wasn't the Lauren I knew. Or was it? Later that evening, I tried to bring it up again. "You've been so distant lately," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I feel like I barely know what's going on in your life anymore." She sighed, rolling her eyes in a way that made me feel like a child being scolded. "It's just work, Daniel. I'm under a lot of pressure, and you're not helping by nagging me about it." Nagging? I wasn't nagging. I was trying to understand why my wife was slipping away from me. But instead of pushing further, I let it go. After all, I trusted her. I had to. But the doubts wouldn't leave me alone. The late nights, the sudden secrecy, the coldness in her tone. It all gnawed at me like a splinter I couldn't remove. Then, one night, Lauren came home with a bottle of wine and a glow about her I hadn't seen in years. She was laughing, her cheeks flushed, her eyes sparkling. I wanted to believe she was just in a good mood, but when I asked what had her so happy, her answer made my stomach drop. "Oh, Chris and I closed a huge deal today," she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. "He's such a genius when it comes to strategy. I've learned so much from him." She talked about Chris as if he were some kind of savior, and for the first time I felt a pang of resentment. Who was this man who seemed to occupy so much of my wife's thoughts? Why did she light up when she talked about him but barely acknowledged me anymore? Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. Lauren was dedicated to her career, and Chris was just her boss. But the uneasy feeling in my chest only grew stronger. The tipping point came a few weeks later when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Lauren had left her laptop open on the dining table, and I walked past it on my way to the kitchen. A notification popped up on the screen. A message from Chris. My heart raced as I glanced at the words. "Last night was unforgettable. Can't wait to see you again." I froze. My hands started to shake as I stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. Last night? Unforgettable? What the hell did that mean? My mind raced through the possibilities, each one worse than the last. Lauren walked into the room just as I was about to take a closer look. She saw me near her laptop and immediately slammed it shut. "What are you doing?" she snapped, her voice sharp and defensive. I just saw a message pop up," I stammered. "Who's Chris? What does he mean by last night was unforgettable?" Her face turned pale, and for a moment, I thought I saw panic flash in her eyes. But then she recovered, crossing her arms and glaring at me. "Unbelievable, Daniel. Are you seriously spying on me now? That was about work. You wouldn't understand." "Work?" I repeated, my voice rising. "That didn't sound like work, Lauren. What's going on? But instead of answering, she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to know the answers to. What was she hiding? And why did I suddenly feel like my entire marriage was built on a foundation of lies? I didn't know it then, but that moment was the beginning of the end. And as much as it hurt, I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost me. Lauren's reaction haunted me for days. Her defensiveness, the way she stormed off instead of explaining, the sudden distance between us. It was all too much to ignore. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, but I also wasn't ready to confront it head-on. Not yet. If she was hiding something, I needed proof. For the next week, I became hyper-aware of everything Lauren did. Every text, every call, every time she smiled at her phone. It all fed into my growing paranoia. She seemed happier than she had in months, but not with me. It was as if she was living in a bubble I wasn't part of. One night, while she was in the shower, I decided to take a closer look at her phone. I hated myself for it. It felt invasive, wrong, but I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in my head. She always kept her phone locked, but I'd seen her enter the passcode enough times to memorize it. My hands trembled as I unlocked it and began scrolling through her messages. What I found wasn't what I expected. Her texts with Chris were mostly about work, at least the ones she hadn't deleted. But there was a folder in her photo gallery labeled Work Trips. Inside were dozens of pictures. Lauren and Chris at restaurants, at a hotel bar, even on a rooftop overlooking the city skyline. They looked too comfortable, too close. In one picture, Chris had his arm around her, and she was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. I felt sick. These weren't just colleagues celebrating a job well done. There was an intimacy in those photos that screamed of betrayal. I couldn't believe this was the woman I'd spent a decade of my life with. The woman I thought I knew. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Lauren, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. Was she in love with him? Was I just some placeholder while she lived out her fantasy with Chris? I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I knew she'd deny it. I needed more. The next day I called in sick to work. While Lauren was out at her business meetings, I started digging deeper. I checked our shared bank account and found charges I didn't recognize. A luxury spa, a fancy steakhouse downtown, and a boutique hotel I knew we'd never stayed at together. It didn't take a genius to put the pieces together. Lauren was using our money to fund her secret life with Chris. But the final blow came later that afternoon. I found an envelope hidden in the back of her closet, tucked behind a stack of old sweaters. Inside were printed copies of emails between her and Chris. They weren't explicit, but the tone was unmistakable. They talked about their getaways, their plans for the future, and even joked about how clueless I was. One email from Chris stood out. Once everything's settled, we'll be free to do whatever we want. He's too blind to see it coming. That was me. They were talking about me. I felt an anger rise in me that I'd never felt before. They weren't just sneaking around behind my back. They were planning something. Something that involved me and not in a good way. I didn't know what they were up to, but I knew I had to stop it. That night, I acted as if everything was normal. I cooked dinner, asked Lauren about her day, and even laughed at her half-hearted jokes. But inside I was seething. I wanted to scream at her, to throw the emails in her face and demand answers. But I held back. If they thought I was clueless, I'd use that to my advantage. As I lay in bed that night, pretending to sleep, I made a decision. Lauren and Chris had underestimated me. They thought I was just some naive husband who wouldn't notice what was happening right under his nose. But they were wrong. I wasn't going to sit back and let them ruin my life. If they wanted to play games, I was ready to play, and I wasn't planning to lose. The morning after my discovery, I woke up with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. Lauren left early for work, kissing me on the cheek like everything was normal. The audacity of it made my blood boil, but I kept my composure. If I wanted to outmaneuver her and Chris, I needed to stay one step ahead. I took the day off again, this time to gather information. I didn't just want to confirm the affair. I wanted to uncover everything. Their lies, their plans, their schemes. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me and come out unscathed. I started by contacting a private investigator. It wasn't cheap, but at this point, I didn't care. I handed over everything I had. The suspicious bank charges, the emails, and even the photos I'd found in Lauren's phone. The investigator, a sharp woman named Rachel, assured me she'd get to the bottom of it. "Give me a week," she said, "and I'll have everything you need." But I wasn't about to sit back and wait. I needed answers now, so I decided to follow Lauren myself. That evening, I told her I had to work late. She barely looked up from her phone, muttering something about being busy with work stuff too. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and tailed her. She drove to a hotel downtown, not the fancy boutique hotel from the bank statement, but a more discreet one on the outskirts of the city. My heart pounded as I parked a safe distance away and watched her go inside. 5 minutes later, Chris walked in. He wasn't even trying to be subtle, dressed in his tailored suit and carrying a smug look that made me want to punch him through the window. I waited for over an hour, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When they finally came out, they looked like a couple on a honeymoon, laughing, touching, completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching. It was all I could do not to confront them right there. But I knew I had to be smarter than that. That night, I barely slept. The image of Lauren and Chris together burned in my mind like a brand. I kept asking myself, how did it come to this? What did I do wrong? But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about me. This was about her, the lies, the deceit, the selfishness. She had chosen to betray me, and now she was planning something far worse. The next day, Rachel called with an update. "You were right," she said. "There's a lot more going on than just an affair." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Rachel hesitated for a moment before continuing. "It looks like Chris has been using company funds to finance this affair. He's been funneling money into a private account under Lauren's name. It's not a small amount, Daniel. We're talking 6 figures. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. 6 figures? Lauren didn't just betray me. She was actively helping Chris steal money. And if they were caught, her name was on that account. She'd go down with him, and there was no way she didn't know that. "Do you think she's in on it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Honestly, I don't think she's a pawn in this. From what I've found, she's been helping him cover his tracks. This isn't just an affair, Daniel. This is fraud." I hung up the phone and sat there in silence, trying to process what I just heard. Lauren wasn't just cheating on me. She was complicit in a crime. And if I didn't act fast, I could get dragged into it too. But instead of despair, I felt something else. Determination. If Lauren and Chris thought they could outsmart me, they were wrong. I wasn't going to let them ruin my life, my finances, or my reputation. They'd already taken enough from me, but now it was my turn to take something from them. That night, I began laying the groundwork for my revenge. It wasn't going to be quick or easy, but I didn't care. I wasn't just going to expose their affair. I was going to destroy everything they'd built together. Over the next few days, I began to piece together a plan. If Lauren and Chris wanted to play dirty, I was prepared to play smarter. I wasn't going to confront them yet. No, I needed to dismantle everything they had built together first. My anger was no longer blind. It was calculated, precise, and relentless. Rachel, the private investigator, had come through with more than just financial evidence. She discovered that Chris was using his corporate position to orchestrate shady deals, funneling money into private accounts, including one under Lauren's name. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. They weren't just cheating on me. They were embezzling on a scale that could ruin lives, including mine if I didn't act fast. But as dangerous as this was, I saw an opportunity. I started by gathering copies of every piece of evidence Rachel had found. Emails, bank statements, and even surveillance footage of Chris and Lauren together. I created a digital folder and a backup hard drive, making sure I had everything stored securely. Then, I reached out to an attorney who specialized in white-collar crimes. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to understand the gravity of the situation and how I could protect myself. His advice was simple but critical. Distance yourself from anything tied to her financially, and document everything. That advice came just in time. Lauren had always handled our finances, but I began reviewing our joint accounts and discovered something horrifying. She had drained nearly $20,000 from our savings over the past few months. The transactions were subtle, smaller amounts spread out over time, but the total was undeniable. My money wasn't just funding her affair. It was part of their entire scheme. That night, while Lauren was out working late again, I took my first major step. I opened a new bank account in my name only and began transferring my direct deposits there. I left just enough in our joint account to keep her from noticing. Next, I contacted a forensic accountant to track down any additional funds Lauren might have been hiding. If she thought she could bleed me dry and run off into the sunset with Chris, she was in for a rude awakening. But the real turning point came a few days later. Rachel called me with another bombshell. "Daniel, you need to see this." She sent me a file containing copies of text messages between Lauren and Chris. Apparently, Chris wasn't as smart as he thought. He'd been using a burner phone, but Rachel had traced it back to him. The messages were sickening, but one in particular stood out. "Lauren, once the account is secure, we'll be free. I can't wait to leave this miserable life behind. Chris, don't worry, babe. He'll never see it coming. He's too stupid to figure this out." Too stupid? The words burned into my mind like a brand. They weren't just planning to leave me. They were planning to take everything I had worked for and leave me humiliated. That was when I knew I couldn't just expose them. I had to destroy them. The next phase of my plan required patience. I started acting normal, too normal. I complimented Lauren more, cooked her favorite meals, and even suggested we plan a weekend getaway. She seemed wary at first, but then she leaned into it. She probably thought I was still clueless, or worse, trying to win her back. Either way, it worked in my favor. She didn't suspect a thing. While I played the part of the doting husband, I was laying traps behind the scenes. With Rachel's help, I tracked down Chris's corporate email and compiled a dossier of his fraudulent activities. I also dug deeper into Lauren's role in the scheme, finding every detail I could that tied her to the illegal transfers. I even set up a meeting with Chris's company's internal audit team, posing as an anonymous whistleblower. By the time I was done, I had enough evidence to bring their entire operation crashing down. But I wasn't done yet. Revenge, after all, is best served cold. One evening, as Lauren sat across from me at the dinner table, I couldn't help but marvel at how calm she looked. She had no idea that her entire world was about to implode. She talked about her day, about how busy she'd been at work, and I nodded along, playing my role perfectly. Inside, I felt a strange mixture of anger and exhilaration. I wasn't just reclaiming my life, I was taking hers apart piece by piece. The next morning, I sent an anonymous package to Chris's company, containing every piece of evidence I had gathered about his embezzlement. I also included a letter outlining his affair with Lauren, knowing it would add fuel to the fire. Then, I sat back and waited for the storm to hit, and hit it did. A week later, Lauren came home in a panic. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she slammed the door behind her. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "Chris got called into an emergency meeting at work, and he hasn't answered my calls all day." I played dumb, feigning concern. "That's strange. Do you think something happened?" She nodded, pacing the room. "I don't know, but it's bad. He told me this morning that someone's been digging into the accounts. If they find anything, we're screwed. We're screwed." Her words hung in the air, confirming everything I already knew. She was in this up to her neck, and now she was finally starting to feel the heat. As I watched her unravel, I couldn't help but smile. She still didn't realize that I was the one pulling the strings. Lauren's panic was palpable. She spent the evening glued to her phone, pacing around the house and muttering under her breath. I stayed quiet, watching her from the couch, pretending to be engrossed in a TV show. Inside, though, I was savoring every moment. This was just the beginning, and the first domino was about to fall. The next morning, she left for work earlier than usual, saying she needed to check in on Chris. The way she said his name made my skin crawl, but I kept my face neutral. "Good luck," I said, hiding the smirk tugging at the corners of my mouth. As soon as she left, I called Rachel. "What's the latest?" I asked. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Chris has been suspended pending an internal investigation. It looks like the company took your evidence seriously. They've already frozen the accounts he was using and flagged Lauren's name in connection with the funds. She's not going to get away with this." Hearing that felt like a weight lifting off my chest. But I wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. There was still more to do, and Lauren still thought she was in control. That evening, she came home looking visibly shaken. She poured herself a glass of wine, her usual coping mechanism, and sat down at the kitchen table. "Something's happening at work," she said, her voice unsteady. "Chris is under investigation. They think he's been stealing money." I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Wow, that's serious. Do they have proof?" She shook her head, avoiding my eyes. "I don't know. He said it's all a misunderstanding, but I don't know, Daniel. It's bad." I could see the cracks forming in her facade. She was terrified, not just for Chris but for herself. She knew she was involved, even if she didn't know how much I already knew. "Well," I said, leaning back in my chair, "if he's innocent, I'm sure it'll all work out." The words felt bitter on my tongue, but I managed to keep a straight face. Over the next few days, the tension in our house was unbearable. Lauren was constantly on edge, snapping at me over the smallest things. She was clearly unraveling, and I could tell she was starting to suspect that her perfect little world was falling apart. But then came the breaking point. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Lauren's phone buzzed on the counter. She was in the other room, so I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Chris. "I'm screwed. They've frozen everything. We need to talk now." Without thinking, I picked up the phone and scrolled through their recent messages. What I found confirmed everything I'd already suspected. And more. Chris had been using Lauren as his accomplice, coaching her on how to move money and cover their tracks. But now that the walls were closing in, he was throwing her under the bus. One message stood out. "Chris, if this comes back on us, you'll have to take the fall. I can't risk losing everything." I couldn't help but laugh. Chris, the self-proclaimed genius, was as slimy as I'd thought. And now he was trying to pin everything on Lauren. I put the phone down just as Lauren walked back into the room. "Who was that?" she asked, eyeing me suspiciously. "Just a notification," I said casually, handing her the phone. "You might want to check it." She snatched the phone from my hand and scanned the message. Her face turned pale, and she muttered something under her breath before storming out of the room. I could hear her arguing with Chris over the phone, her voice rising with every sentence. "You promised this wouldn't happen. How could you let it get this far?" she yelled. I listened from the hallway, a strange mix of satisfaction and pity washing over me. She was finally feeling the consequences of her actions, and I wasn't done yet. The next day, I got a call from Rachel. "It's done," she said. "Chris has been officially terminated, and the company is pressing charges. Lauren's name has come up in the investigation, but they don't have enough to go after her yet." That word hung in the air like a storm cloud. I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down on her. But I had one final move to make. That night, while Lauren was in the shower, I retrieved the envelope of evidence I'd been keeping hidden. It contained everything: the financial records, the emails, the texts. I placed it on the kitchen counter with a note that simply read, "You made your choice. Now it's my turn." When she came out of the bathroom, her hair still damp and a towel wrapped around her, she saw the envelope and froze. Her face went white as she opened it, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is this?" "It's everything," I said, my tone calm but firm. "Everything you've been hiding from me. Everything you've done." She looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes. But I didn't feel sympathy. Not anymore. I trusted you, Lauren, I said. And you betrayed me. You and Chris thought you could get away with this. But you were wrong. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, Lauren was truly speechless. And for the first time, I felt like I was in control. Lauren stood there, clutching the envelope as if it were a lifeline. Her lips trembled, but her usual sharp tongue was nowhere to be found. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting for her to say something, anything. But the silence stretched on, and I wasn't about to let her off the hook. "Cat got your tongue?" I asked, my voice cold. "Or are you just trying to figure out which lie to spin this time?" Her eyes darted from me to the pile of evidence in her hands. "Daniel, it's not what it looks like," she stammered. I couldn't help but laugh. A bitter, hollow sound that echoed through the kitchen. "Not what it looks like? Really? Because it looks like you've been cheating on me with your boss while helping him embezzle money from his company. Did I miss anything?" Her face crumpled, but I didn't feel any satisfaction in her distress. "Not yet. I didn't mean for it to get this far," she whispered. "Chris," he pressured me. I didn't have a choice. I raised an eyebrow, folding my arms tighter. "No choice? You had a choice every single day, Lauren. You chose to lie to me, to steal from me, to humiliate me. Don't you dare play the victim now." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I wasn't buying it. This wasn't regret, it was fear. Fear of being caught, fear of losing the cushy life she thought she could escape with Chris, and fear, perhaps, of what I was going to do next. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. "Do you want me to beg? To apologize? Fine, I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm sorry I made a mistake." "A mistake," I repeated, my voice rising. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something stupid during an argument. What you did wasn't a mistake, Lauren. It was calculated. And now you're going to face the consequences." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw genuine panic. "What do you mean? You're not going to turn me in, are you?" I let the question hang in the air, enjoying the way it made her squirm. "Oh, don't worry," I said, my tone laced with mock reassurance. "I'm not going to call the cops yet, but I have already sent everything to Chris's company. You might want to brace yourself for when the investigators come knocking." Lauren's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair. "Daniel, please," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this. We can fix this. I'll leave Chris. I'll do whatever you want." The audacity of her words made my blood boil. She still thought she could manipulate me, as if this were just another fight we could patch up. "It's too late, Lauren," I said. "You didn't just betray me. You broke us. And there's no coming back from that." I left her sitting there, drowning in her own guilt and desperation, and went upstairs to pack a bag. I couldn't stand to be in the same house as her anymore. I wasn't going to let her tears, her pleas, or her excuses sway me. She had made her choices, and now she was going to live with them. As I zipped up my suitcase, my phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. It was a screenshot of a news article, "High-profile executive terminated amid embezzlement scandal." Chris's face stared back at me from the headline, looking smug and confident, clearly taken before his world started falling apart. I couldn't help but smile. One down, one to go. When I came back downstairs, Lauren was still sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the evidence in front of her. I set my suitcase by the door and turned to face her. "I'll be staying at a hotel for now," I said. "I've already contacted a lawyer to start the divorce process. Don't try to contact me unless it's through him." Her head snapped up, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of anger in her tear-streaked face. "So that's it? You're just walking away?" I shook my head, my voice steady. "No, Lauren. You walked away the moment you chose him over me. I'm just making it official." With that, I grabbed my bag and walked out the door, leaving her sitting in the wreckage of the life she had destroyed. But as much as I wanted to feel triumphant, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. There was still one last card I needed to play. With Chris and Lauren's lives in freefall, I had one final card to play. A parting gift for the two people who thought they could ruin me. By now, their affair was no secret. Whispers of their sordid romance and the scandal surrounding Chris's downfall were spreading like wildfire. But I wasn't satisfied with them just losing their jobs or facing legal consequences. I wanted them to feel the humiliation and betrayal they had so willingly dealt me. I sat down and composed an anonymous email, carefully wording it to ensure it struck the perfect nerve. The recipient, Chris's wife, Heather. I'd met her a few times at corporate events, and she seemed like a kind, intelligent woman. She didn't deserve this any more than I did, and while I hated the idea of being the one to shatter her world, she had a right to know the truth. The email read, "Dear Heather, I don't know how to say this, but I feel it's something you need to know. Your husband, Chris, has been having an affair with my wife, Lauren, for the better part of a year. Their relationship is more than just infidelity. It's tied to an embezzlement scheme that has landed Chris in hot water at work. I know this is a lot to process, and I'm truly sorry to be the bearer of such devastating news. But I believe you deserve the truth. Attached, you'll find copies of texts, emails, and photos that confirm everything I've told you. You deserve better than this, just as I did. Take care. A concerned stranger." I hesitated for a moment before hitting send. It wasn't out of guilt. I had none left for Lauren or Chris, but out of sympathy for Heather. Still, she deserved the truth, and I wasn't going to let them walk away without facing the full consequences of their actions. 2 days later, I received a response. "Thank you for telling me the truth. I suspected something was wrong, but I didn't have the proof. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but at least now I know what kind of man Chris really is. I hope you find peace in all of this. Heather." I closed the email, satisfied that I had done the right thing. Heather's reaction was calm and measured, far more dignified than the chaos Chris and Lauren had created. But I knew the fallout from her discovery would be anything but calm for them. Lauren, on the other hand, was in full panic mode. She started calling me incessantly, leaving voicemails that alternated between begging for forgiveness and lashing out in anger. I ignored every single one. It wasn't until she showed up at the hotel I was staying at that I realized how desperate she had become. "Daniel, please," she said, tears streaming down her face as she stood in the lobby. "We need to talk." I folded my arms and stared at her. "Talk about what, Lauren? About how you lied to me, stole from me, humiliated me? I think we've said everything that needs to be said." Her eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape from the weight of her own actions. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I did, but Chris, he used me. I didn't know what I was getting into." "Stop," I said, my tone icy. "Stop blaming Chris. You're not some innocent bystander, Lauren. You made choices. You knew what you were doing. And now you're paying the price." She reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "Daniel, I still love you," she said, her voice trembling. "We can fix this. We can start over." I laughed bitterly. "Love? You don't even know what that word means. Lauren, if you loved me, you wouldn't have done any of this. We're done. Go be with Chris or whatever's left of him. You deserve each other." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the lobby, a broken shell of the person she used to be. It wasn't the triumphant moment I had imagined, but it was enough. She had to live with the consequences of her choices, and I was finally free of her toxicity. Later that night, I got another call from Rachel. "You're not going to believe this," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "What now?" I asked, already bracing myself. "Chris has been arrested. They've got enough evidence to charge him with embezzlement, and the company is suing him for damages. Lauren's name has come up in the investigation, too, but it looks like they're treating her as a secondary accomplice." "Good," I said. "Let her deal with the fallout. I'm done cleaning up her messes." Rachel chuckled. "You've really outplayed them, Daniel. It's not every day I see someone turn a situation like this around. Her words stayed with me as I poured myself a drink and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The storm was finally passing, and I was ready to start rebuilding my life. But there was still one more thing to do before I could truly move on. With Chris arrested and Lauren under investigation, I should have felt victorious. But as the dust began to settle, I realized that while they were reaping what they'd sown, I still had loose ends to tie up. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life and ensuring I'd never be dragged into their mess again. Lauren had been quiet since our confrontation at the hotel. Her calls and messages stopped abruptly, which only made me more suspicious. Was she plotting something? Trying to salvage what was left of her life? I couldn't be sure, but I wasn't taking any chances. The next morning, my lawyer called. Good news, Daniel. The divorce proceedings are moving faster than expected. With the evidence we've submitted about Lauren's actions, the court is likely to rule in your favor on all financial matters. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. So she won't be able to claim anything from me? That's correct, he said. Given the circumstances, you're in a strong position. But there's one more thing to consider. What's that? I asked, already dreading the answer. She may try to pin her role in the embezzlement on you. Even though there's no evidence linking you to the crimes, her desperation could lead her to make baseless accusations. Be prepared. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I'll be ready. That evening, I decided to pay one last visit to the house Lauren and I had shared. I hadn't been back since I left, and part of me dreaded seeing the place again. But there was something I needed to retrieve, something that symbolized the end of this chapter. When I arrived, the house was dark. Lauren's car wasn't in the driveway, and the air was eerily still. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of the home hitting me like a wave. For a moment, I stood there, letting the memories wash over me. The laughter, the love, the lies. It all felt like a distant dream. I went straight to the office, where I'd kept a small box of personal items. Letters, photos, mementos from the early days of our relationship. I wasn't sure why I wanted it, but something inside me needed to hold on to the reminder of what I'd lost. Not Lauren, but the version of her I thought I'd known. As I sifted through the box, I noticed something tucked underneath the papers. It was a small envelope, one I didn't recognize. My heart raced as I opened it, and what I found inside made my blood run cold. It was a series of printed emails, similar to the ones I'd already seen, but these were different. These emails detailed a plan. Chris and Lauren had been plotting to sell off assets in my name, including a property I'd inherited from my parents. They were going to liquidate everything, take the money, and leave me with nothing. I clenched the papers in my hand, the anger boiling over. This wasn't just infidelity or fraud anymore. This was a direct attack on everything I had left. They were going to steal my family's legacy, the last piece of my past I still cherished. I wasn't just angry, I was done. The next morning, I sent a copy of the emails to my lawyer and Rachel. Make sure these get to the authorities, I said. And let's make it clear that Lauren wasn't just an accomplice. She was a co-conspirator. Rachel didn't hold back her satisfaction. This is the nail in the coffin, Daniel. She's not walking away from this. That same day, I got word that Chris's trial date had been set. The company was pursuing the embezzlement charges aggressively, and Chris was facing years in prison. As for Lauren, she was being subpoenaed as part of the investigation. Her name was now public, tied to the scandal she thought she could hide from. A week later, I received a text from Heather, Chris's now estranged wife. Thank you for telling me the truth. I filed for divorce and am working with the company to ensure Chris doesn't take anything else from me. I'm sorry for what you went through, but I'm glad we both found the strength to move on. Best of luck, Daniel. Her message was a reminder that not all was lost. People could rebuild after betrayal, and I was ready to do the same. The day the divorce was finalized, I walked out of the courthouse with a sense of closure. Lauren didn't even show up, likely too humiliated to face me. My lawyer assured me that the ruling was airtight. She would get nothing from me, not a single cent. As I stood on the courthouse steps, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The nightmare was over. Lauren and Chris had tried to destroy me, but in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. I had emerged from the ashes, not unscathed, but stronger. That evening, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window of my new apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. I didn't feel triumphant or vindictive. I felt free. The memories of Lauren and Chris would fade with time, but the lessons I'd learned would stay with me forever. Trust is fragile, and betrayal cuts deep, but resilience is the ultimate revenge. As I raised my glass, I whispered to myself, "Here's to new beginnings." And with that, I turned away from the past and stepped into my future.